My name is Keith, and from the time I was about 4 years old, I was interested in being a part of the entertainment business. And I've done many things throughout that time, from singing in bands, writing music, hosting television shows, everything involved in the professional wrestling business. And I've written comic books, done a lot of things, and almost all of those things failed in some way or another. But I still kept going. I still wanted to continue to create. And there's just something in me that drives me to create. And I started thinking, well, what is it that drives anyone to create? And that's going to be the point of this podcast. We're going to talk to people from all aspects of the entertainment industry. We're going to find out what made them interested in creating art, and why, when faced with success, when faced with failure, the ups and downs of life and life in the entertainment business, they continue to create. So, and hopefully we'll have some good and interesting conversations along the way that you'll be interested in hearing. So tune in to the Most Excellent Entertainment Podcast. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Most Excellent Entertainment Podcast. I'm your host, Keith. I'm coming to you from my new house. So if the sound is a little echoey in here, it's because the place is empty. And I'm being joined today by writer, distinguished Toastmaster, public speaker, a man who's written many articles on immigration and things of that nature for Forbes magazine and stuff. And he's also a professional lawyer. Welcome, Mr. Andy Semotiuk.
Thank you. Happy to be with you here today.
Happy to have you here. So let's start from the beginning. What was it that made you realize that you wanted to be a writer?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. And it started back when I was in college, in first year college at UBC in Vancouver, Canada. And I took an English course, and I was a catastrophe. Like, I just couldn't do it. I was trying all year long to try and just stay up with everybody. And finally, at the end of the year, the professor probably just took pity on me, and he gave me a 50% mark so I could pass, because he knew if I didn't pass English 101, I couldn't continue with my college studies. And so that's the start. I thought, hey, listen, I'm a good talker. I like to tell stories and stuff like that. I'm going to go down that track. And as you mentioned, I was involved in Toastmasters. In fact, I've been involved in Toastmasters for 35 years. I went once a week to a club meeting. And, there people practice their public speaking skills and also their leadership skills. And, people shared what was good, what wasn't. Don't shift around on your feet. Look at your audience. Don't look down at your papers. Don't say and things like that. So after 35 years, I felt I was getting pretty good at speaking. I got this award. Actually, you can see it above my head here. It's a plaque. I got that for what's called being a distinguished Toastmaster, which is the highest level in a Toastmaster organization after 35 years. Now, some people can get that like in 6 months, but it took me 35 years. Anyway, I got it. But the world was saying, no, Andy, no, we don't want you to be speaking. We want you to be writing. And I couldn't believe it, because I thought I was a lousy writer, but slowly, I wrote article here, article there, published them in, these sort of regional and small town newspapers and stuff like that. And over time, as I studied law, I became pretty good at writing. And later, actually, I broke through and I became a UN correspondent. I worked in New York for a couple of years at the United Nations as a correspondent. And I wrote for like a string of English language newspapers in Canada. They were called Southern News Services, and some in the United States, a couple of newspapers in the United States. And after 2 years, I went back to law. I was practicing law. I'm an immigration lawyer, US and Canadian. And as I was practicing law in Toronto, with the help of a friend here, Sean Barry, who works with me at Pace Law Firm here, we were posting reactions to people who were writing articles on immigration on, on various sites. And one day I got an email from Forbes, and it said, "Hey, would you like to write some articles on immigration for us?" And I said, "Would I? Of course I would." And that was 10 years ago. And I've been writing with them, well, for them for the last 10 years.
So once you got going writing, I mean, for a magazine like Forbes and even the local papers and stuff, when did you decide to make the leap into writing actual novels?
Okay, that was a bit of uh, a transition out of my US and Canadian immigration work. And what I noticed, one of the first books I published, was that these young people that I was helping out, most of them were going into the professions like engineer, architect, a lawyer, doctor, whatever it was. And I was helping them get across the border, or either go from Canada to the United States, or from the United States to Canada, or from somewhere else into North America. But I noticed that most of them had one or more of three problems. And the three problems were money, time, or balance. And all of us, like I right now have one of those, usually one of those is eating at me. I think all of us face those kind of problems.
Sure.
I decided I'm going to write a book about this to help these people along. And I wrote the book. It's called, I've got it right here. It's called The Young Professional. That's what it looks like.
Okay.
All these books are on Amazon, by the way, if anybody wants to take a look at them. But I published the book, and a publisher said, "Yeah, we want to publish this thing." And the way I found the publisher was I hung around at Kinko's, and I saw other books that were similar in nature to what I had. So I contacted the publisher. They're called Cengage. And they said, yeah, we'll publish your book. And they did. And that's how I kind of started.
Awesome. So you've also published some humor, like some joke books, as well as some
Right.
books about your family history.
Right.
When did you and one of your books is actually was written by your son when he was 12, I guess, is
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. This book here is called 401 Goofy Jokes for Kids. And it's quite a story, actually. One day he came home from school. He was 12 years old. And he says, I have to start a business. There's a group called Junior Achievement. And what
Sure.
they do is they go into schools and they get kids to start a business. They teach them how to run a business. So they said to him, "You got to start a business." I says to him, "Well, what kind of business you want to start?" And he said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, what do you like to do?" And he said, "Well, I like jokes." I
Hmm.
said, "Well, why don't we do something with jokes?" "Well, what should we do?" "Well, how about we collect some jokes and publish a book?" I said, "Yeah, let's do that." And so the short story is we got some kids to contribute books, jokes for the book. Not this, yeah, not that one, this one. And
All right.
and eventually he came out with this book. It's called 401 Goofy Jokes for Kids. And we got some good reviews. For example, Larry Wilde, who's America's best-selling humorist, wrote a note saying very funny. Dan
Right.
Clark, who is a leading American speaker and humorist, wrote a note saying a fantastic collection of funnies, and so on. So Mark Victor Hansen, who wrote a co-author of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series, actually gave us a little congratulations on a great idea, make it a bestseller. So
That's
it's
awesome.
there. So anyway, that's what happened there.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So when you decided to start writing about your family history, what prompted that? Because your current book is about your great aunt, but then you also wrote a book about your mother, right? Is that correct?
Yeah. Actually, Keith, I really appreciate that you've done some research on me.
Of
That's
course.
very nice
Yeah.
of you. Um, I'm involved in the immigrant world, because I'm doing immigration law, and I myself am not an immigrant. I was born in Canada, but my folks came over from Ukraine. And, we all come from somewhere, Ireland or, I don't know, Mexico or wherever. I came from Ukraine, or at least my
Sure.
family came from Ukraine. And so the immigrant experience is something that I've always valued, the hardships, sometimes the broken dreams and, building from scratch again and all that. That's something that moved me. And I decided, well, I'll since I'm in the field and I'm working in the field anyway, I'll write a book, capturing some of the story about an immigrant experience. And the result is these two books that you've mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, we'll get back to those books, but I also wanted to ask you, I've talked to a few authors, and it seems like a lot of the authors who write nonfiction have a fiction book percolating in their brain somewhere. Do you have any interest to write a fiction novel, or are you going to strictly stick with nonfiction?
That's a great question, Keith. That's a really great question.
Thank
The
you.
answer is no. I'm not
Okay.
a fiction writer. I believe this about fiction, that fiction entails, usually entails emotional truth, a deeper kind of truth than you can find in just like factual truth.
Sure.
When I read the books I write are from real life experience, sort of. I'm just relating what people did in their lives. I'm fascinated by biographies and memoirs, and what makes you tick, and what's deep inside your soul and in your heart that you want to, that you're after. In the novel area, they can reach even far further and deeper because they can make up the storyline the way you want to, the way the author wants to. And the
Yeah.
key is, can the author convey an emotional truth? It may not be true in terms of, exactly what happens and is it
Right.
reality or not. That may not be in the scorecard, but the message that gets through from that author can be far deeper than anything I write about. But I don't have the talent, like to be in that area. Like my wife would have the talent, but she's not a writer. She doesn't want to write. But she has, she reads novels every day. She's reading a novel. My daughter is in the same boat. But I'm unfortunately, I haven't, like, I read novels. For example,
Right.
recently I read Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Now,
Hmm.
that's like heavy duty reading, like it's
Yeah.
a book about this thick,
Right. Right.
but it's fantastic. It's just absolutely fantastic. I could
Yeah.
never reach those heights. I don't have the gift that he has, you know. I admire people like that,
Sure.
but it's just it's not in my cards.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, but being able to do all the research and get it in chronological order and create a direction out of someone's life. I mean, that's a tough task in
Yeah.
itself, so
Yeah, like in my case, if I write about a memoir or a biography or something like that, there's truth there,
yeah,
and there's emotion in there. It's not like it's cold, journalism. He went to the store, he bought two cases of beer, and then he went home. It's more than just the facts linked together. There is a moral to the story in my books.
sure.
There is a story in my book. In all my books, there's a story.
Yeah.
I believe, and I can see you're a pretty deep thinker. Like you're. I think you're like tuned in this area,
Yeah,
judging
I
by your
appreciate that.
questions.
I
Um,
appreciate that.
but I think we probably share a kind of a similar outlook in terms of, being able to make something out, make some kind of contribution to this world through writing, like make a difference somehow. So
Yeah,
that's what I
absolutely.
do with my stuff.
Awesome. So your great aunt, talking about your current book, she was a pretty famous opera singer, right? Is that
Yes,
where the
yeah.
story kind of starts?
Yes, she was the world's leading opera star, soprano, in the opera's golden age, which is the first decade of the 1900s.
Okay.
Now, if you're not into opera, and maybe you're not into the history from the 1900s, this sounds like a boring topic, right? But it's
Maybe.
not. It's not. And I'll tell you why.
All right.
The reason is because she rose from obscurity to the top of her profession, in this case, opera. Now, okay, I'm not into opera, I'm more like into law and writing. You're obviously an interviewer, among other things, and run a podcast and so on. So these are the fields that we chose, and we're trying to do something in our fields. And the people who are listening are probably got, their fields, maybe teachers or engineers or whatever. But she chose this field early in her life. Her father confronted her and said, okay, look, things were not going so good in her life while she's still in obscurity. And the father said, well, look, what the heck do you want to do with your life? And she says, I love to sing. I'd like to sing. And I said, well, if you're going to sing, I'm going to send you to opera school. And he sent her to a local opera school and then eventually to Milan, to Italy, where she studied with one of the top teachers of opera back in the day. This is in the late 1800s. And now that wasn't cheap, to send someone to Milan from
Sure.
Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
So like they were scraping by, and this family had 8 kids, like it's punishing. But they scraped and scraped, and she got a break. The break was, I'll tell you a little about that story. She
Sure.
was studying with this teacher in Milan, and the teacher saw that money is tight and she's having a hard time. She says, "Well, look, to put it in modern terms, there's Broadway and there's off Broadway in New York, right?
Right.
So not everybody shows up on Broadway right away. First, you have to go off Broadway and learn your lessons, and then one day you become a star." So the same thing was true in Milan, in Italy. The top theater was called La Scala back then, world famous theater for opera. But there were all kinds of regional and local theaters also in the area. And these guys who composed these operas were looking for talent to attract the talent to their operas. And one guy who was kind of searching around in the off-Broadway scene, so to speak, was a guy named Giacomo Puccini. Now, this guy was one of the greatest opera composers that the world has ever seen. Not back then, but later. And he saw her, like she auditioned for a play, for an opera, and she got the part. And one day while she's auditioning or sort of rehearsing, he showed up at the rehearsal because he didn't do the picking of the singers, someone else did. And he goes up to her after she sings a while, and he goes, okay, now we're going to start. And she says, start what? And he says, well, we're going to do some serious work. And she says, serious work? Well, I'm doing serious work. And he says, no, I mean really serious work. And she says, well, what do you mean? And he says, well, I want to introduce you to a conductor who's a top conductor, and he's going to teach you how to sing properly, and he did. And so she performed in that opera that he had. It was in Cremona in Italy, and the opera was called Manon Lescaut, I think. And then they became friends, and they performed together in various operas, and she rose in stature. And like I can't share the whole story, but I'll tell you this.
Sure.
She spoke 8 languages. She knew 60 operas by heart. both the lyrics and the music. She performed throughout Europe, throughout North America, or North Africa, in South America and North America. She sang all over the world. And she became a star. And in the early 1900s, while she was already at the top of her fame, Puccini, the same guy, wrote another opera called Madame Butterfly. And he thought, well, I'm going to put this opera on. Now, he didn't approach Solomia, who was my great aunt, this lady here.
Okay.
He approached someone else. Rosina Storchio was her name. And this guy named Zanatello to play the lead roles in his new opera. And briefly about the opera, it's an opera about a geisha girl named Chiyo-Chiyo-san, which is Japanese for butterfly, Madame Butterfly, and how she falls in love with an American naval officer named Pinkerton, who comes to Japan in the 1800s with the American Navy to open up Japan to trade with the West. So they have a romantic relationship. And shortly after that, he announces, oh, I have to go back to America. I'm being called back to America. And he says, but don't worry, I'll come back to you. And she says, well, okay. And so he leaves and she waits for him. And he does not know, but she's pregnant and she gives birth to his son. And she waits a year, 2 years, 3, 5 years, and eventually he returns. He comes back, but with an American wife in tow. And a crisis arises between the father and the mother of the boy, Chiyo-Chiyo-san and Pinkerton. Should the boy be raised in Japan and live a life with a geisha girl, or should the boy go to America with his father and be raised there? And the parents agree the boy should go to America. So in one of the final, parts of the opera, Chiyo-Chiyo-san takes the little boy off to the side and she says this to the boy. She says, look at this face. It's the face of your mother. Remember it. You'll never see it again. And the boy walks off with Pinkerton going back to America, and she later commits suicide. It's a very sad opera, very powerful, very powerful.
Yeah.
So they performed the opera at La Scala, and much to Puccini's surprise and disappointment, it bombed. The audience booed it out of the theater. They whistled and booed. And the next day in all the papers in La Scala was Puccini bombs, dud, opera a dud, terrible opera, and so on. So much so that he canceled the run. He's just one performance and they canceled the run. And he's sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I love this opera, but it's a disaster. What am I going to do? And he figures, well, there's a friend of his whose name is Arturo Toscanini, who was one of the world's leading orchestra directors, conductors. And he figures, well, I'll go talk to Arturo and find out, what should I do? So he goes to see him, and Toscanini says to him, look, you want to rescue this opera? Go see Solomia Krushelnitska was her name. Hard name to remember, but Solomia.
For sure.
Yeah. Talk to her. She's pretty much the only person that can help you get this opera back up on its feet. So he goes to her and he says, hey, look, will you help me with this thing? Now, this is like asking Julia Roberts to perform in a lead role in a film that just bombed with Sandra Bullock as the lead, actor.
Sure.
In her case, she's at the top of her profession, and this guy's asking, lend your credentials and your abilities to this opera and help me resurrect it. But because she was good friends with both of them, she said, okay, I'll do it. And they worked together for several months. One of the biggest challenges she had was she was in her 30s by then, and Chio Chio's son was a teenager. So she had to play a role of a teenager, which was a bit of a leap. But to get into the role, Solomia wore a Japanese kimono for 2 months every day just to get into the role. And after preparing, rewriting the opera and working together to stage it, they staged it at the Teatro Grande in Brescia, Italy, which is about 60 miles east of Milan, in 1904. And the audience, they were all nervous when they're coming on. Like Puccini, Puccini's in the wing of the theaters, chain smoking. All the cast is nervous, wondering what the heck's going to happen here. Like it bombed before, are we going to be booed out? And even the audience was nervous. But Solomia had an enchanting voice. And as soon as she started performing and singing, the audience calmed down and they got into it. So much so. Now, in those days, when they performed an opera on stage, if they liked an aria that they sang, the audience would demand an instant repeat. You had to re-sing the same aria, like an instant replay, because that's the way it was. So they had a few of those through the opera, and at the end of it, it got 7 standing ovations, including Puccini dragged out onto the stage to take a bow. And she went on to sing in that opera 100 times all over Europe. And on the 100th time, she went to Puccini with the script and she said, look, here's your script back. This is the last time I'm performing this opera. And she never performed it again. But it went on to world fame, so much so that it's one of the greatest operas even today. And this year is the 120th anniversary of that opera. 120 years ago, it became famous. And for example, this year it's being performed, coming up in January, it'll be in Toronto at the Opera Theatre in Toronto. And I believe in Milwaukee, it's being put on this year. And I saw that it was put on at the Met in New York this year as well. Yeah, so that's a story about Madame Butterfly and the, my aunt Solomia Krushelnitska.
That's awesome. Like you were saying, Madame Butterfly is one of the most famous operas ever.
Yeah.
I mean, it's even crossed over into popular culture. I don't know if you know this, but Weezer's second album is based on the play, loosely.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's called Pinkerton, and it's loosely based on Madame
No
Butterfly.
kidding.
Yeah.
See, I'm learning something. Wow.
There you go.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. And she basically, I mean, without her, there's a chance it never would have happened. Like,
it wouldn't have happened. Yeah, it wouldn't have. They needed her for that role.
that's
So
amazing.
yeah. Yeah.
So, it seems like your books are kind of about like triumph of the human spirit almost.
Very well put. Yes, yes. They're all on Amazon. If anybody wants to, take a look at them, they're for sale on Amazon. It's also this Solomia book is an audio book on Amazon.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
So people could pick it up through Audible. If you
Yeah.
have an Audible subscription, you could listen to it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And you get a book every month. So with your
Now,
subscription.
for those who are in, like, I'm not a big opera guy,
Right.
despite the fact that I wrote the book. I don't go to opera every month or whatever. I have friends who are like heavy duty into opera.
Right.
But, at this time, people, if you ask people about opera, if they know anything about it, they might say, well, Pavarotti was a big opera
Sure.
star.
Yeah.
And there's a lady named Maria Callas who was, today's version of the leading lady of opera.
Okay.
But these people were before them. Like Toscanini later became the conductor of the NBC orchestra in New York.
Okay.
So they were back in the day, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much of anything about opera, to be honest. I enjoy classical music, but I've never really gotten into opera too much. But I was listening to your story, and I mean, that was kind of what I picked up from it. It's not necessarily a story about opera; it's a story about the human spirit, like I
Yeah.
said, like how you can overcome things, and I mean, from her starting out in unfortunate circumstances to the play bombing, or the opera, I'm sorry, bombing, to
Yeah.
all of it, that all just came together, and
Yeah.
that's it's very cool.
An interesting thing about opera for us non-opera types
Sure,
is that back in the day, that was today television, films and all that, that's what's, current. Back then, they didn't have anything like that, but it was a conversion of, lyrics, music, acting and so on stage. And a person would spend like a whole day at the opera house having coffee, lunch, supper, and watching not one opera, but like 3, 4 operas. It was a way of living almost, a cultural, something to do in terms of a cultural activity.
sure.
So it's a little different today. Opera is not what it used to be, but I still find, even though I'm not, as I mentioned, like a regular, there are aspects of. I'll just share one story with
Sure.
you about how opera can affect someone. I had an elderly aunt in Los Angeles that I helped and lived with and looked after from time to time. I was flying back and forth from Canada to Los Angeles, and she was in her 90s or late 80s. And so I stayed with her and, helped her out a bit. And one night we're having supper, and she's at a stage in her life where she's not everybody's home upstairs, like
Sure.
she's there some of the time, but not all the time. And I'm trying to kind of connect with her, I'm trying to, it was important for me to connect with my aunt, not this Salomia, but my Aunt Helen.
Yeah.
To just to connect, to say hello, how are you, sort of like person to person, heart to heart, so to speak. And she's sitting there eating at the table. And one thing I did is I knew she liked opera. So I played some opera arias for her, in the background while we're eating. And she's listening away, but not registering anything. And I played an aria from the opera. Now, if I can get this right, it's an opera about a clown. Pugliese, I think is it.
Yeah.
Um, and in this aria, this guy's singing, and then he interrupts, like he stops, and he has this laugh, and he goes, ha 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 ha, ha. So the
Yeah.
guy's singing along. She's listening. And this guy's singing this aria, and he stops, and he goes, ha 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 ha, ha. And she stops, and she looks down at the recorder, and she points to it, and she says, "I know that opera." It was a moment where we connected, and I was able to get to her, register with her just for a moment in this world again,
Yeah.
It was a really touching
That's
moment.
really cool. Yeah.
Emotional. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
things like that can happen, with music. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. That's what I was going to say. Not just operas, but music in general. If it's
Oh,
done
yeah.
right, definitely will touch you emotionally. That's kind of what it's there for.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So, you seem to be a pretty successful immigration lawyer. Um, and then you're also an author. How do those two worlds coincide? Like, what's the,
Well, in the world of law and immigration, because I do US and Canadian immigration with the firm called Pace Law Firm in Toronto, it's sort of left brain, right? It's all
right,
like logic, not emotional, but words. Put the words together, fill in the forms that are needed, right? And I might put it this way: it depends on how you look at it. And to draw an analogy, there's this story about three guys that are building a brick wall, and a guy goes up to the first guy and says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Oh, I'm getting $10 an hour for building this wall." Let's go to the second guy. "What are you doing?" He says, "Oh, I'm building a wall." Go to the third guy. "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm building a cathedral." So same work, but different attitude, different approach. So in law, like if you looked at me from day to day and what I do, there's a lot of boring stuff I do. Like I answer the phone, I write notes, I'm answering emails all day long. People come in and ask me questions. Sometimes I have to go out and ask them questions. People yell at me, I have to, keep my cool, and stuff like that.
right?
That's my life.
Yeah.
But I don't want to look at it that way. I want to look at it like I'm building a cathedral. So the way I see it is I say to myself, I help clients improve their lives through immigration. And by doing that, I can affect their life forever by getting them, let's say, permanent residence in a new country. In fact, I can not only affect them, I can affect their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So I can say, and this is what I say to my staff, who don't always buy this argument, but nonetheless, I get it. Not everything's perfect all the time.
Right.
That's what we do around here, is we help people change their lives for the better through immigration.
Awesome.
And what a great thing to be able to do. If you were given an assignment, wouldn't one of the great assignments you could have be to help other people change their lives for the better forever? That's, a powerful thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's where law touches the immigrant experience and writing, which
Right.
is emotional and, like hardship and how do people overcome their shortcomings and things like that. That's the way I kind of put them all together.
Okay. I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. So, um, we've already kind of touched on this throughout the talk, but where can people find you on the internet if they want to find you? Where can they find your books and things like
Ah,
that?
Amazon, just type in my name, Andy Semotiuk, Semotiuk, and you can get any of my books there. But I work for Pace Law Firm, PACE, pacelawfirm.com in Toronto. So if they want to reach me, they can reach me there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the final question that I like to ask every guest who comes on, uh, what is it that keeps you creating and putting things out into the world? You obviously have I just said a minute ago, a pretty successful job as a lawyer. So what is it that makes you continue writing and continue to put these stories out?
That's a great question. And this is a memorable interview for me
Oh, thank you.
because of the questions you're asking.
Thank you.
You know,
Appreciate it.
It's, I'll give you a good, I hope is a good answer. And
Okay.
that's I believe if you scratch deep enough and on every person, when you look at the life of any person, you will find something there that's aching to come out, to be expressed in some way. That's burning, has a burning desire. A person has the burning desire to get it out into the world. Why? Because
Yeah.
we're all unique. Like you and I are unique. You were raised somewhere else than I was. You went to different schools. You had different parents. You have a different background, etc., than I do, right? And we're all unique that way.
Yeah.
Right? So we're in this world to have a point of view, in my opinion, and to make the world, I hope, to make the world a better place by contributing what we know, what we have that's worthwhile to, our common future, so to speak. So I didn't know I did, but I had this burning desire, this aching stuff that was inside me that needed to get out. And here I am. Like, why am I here? Like, if I asked myself, like, I'm on a podcast with someone I've never met before, right? It's sort of like, here we are, right?
Yeah.
But I think you're on a similar journey to mine. You're also out here, doing something that your heart is telling you, well, I should do this,
Absolutely.
And,
Yeah.
maybe there's not the big bucks here. We're not like Elon Musk, $240 billion worth, but
Yeah.
we're doing it, because it's something that's meant to be for us. And so that's the answer I have for you.
That's awesome. First of all, I want to thank you so much for the compliments during the interview. I appreciate that. I really try my hardest to come up with questions that will relate to the person who's on the podcast, as opposed to just throwing out a bunch of random stuff
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. And I appreciate you being here. This was you're a great storyteller. So I really appreciate that. And before we go, I want to thank my producer, Tyler Martin, and ME Studios. If it wasn't for him, this podcast would not be happening. So he's allowing me to do something that I love, and I really appreciate that. And Andy, thank you so much for coming. This has been a great conversation.
Indeed. Yeah.
Thanks. So, and be sure you guys tune in next week. You can find us on Spotify, find us on YouTube. Those are our two main things, and we're also all over the place wherever you find podcasts. Just look for the Most Excellent Entertainment Podcast. And we'll talk to you guys next week. Thanks a lot.